One thing that's probably been the most important thing for me in my own healing is to understand trauma. And I've understood the developmental trauma, which has been very helpful in understanding what happened to me and why I have responded the way I have during my life. And I've learned a lot about the nervous system, the survival system, fight, flight, freeze, and about developmental trauma in particular has been really important to know more about that and how it works. So I thought today we could go through just kind of the basics of trauma, and then afterwards we can have some time to talk about it. So probably the biggest thing is that our system is set up to keep us alive. It doesn't really care if we're happy. It doesn't care if we're fulfilled. All it wants to do is keep us alive. And that system is from, the day that we're conceived, I guess. But it doesn't really care about anything else. And that system is very set up to remember danger and to respond immediately to danger. Babies are born with not much of a brain. The brain develops through interaction. Developmental trauma in particular is a piece that we can all, probably there's not very many people, if any, that have had optimum situations in childhood where their brains really developed well. And where most of us are on a continuum from, a big disaster to not too bad and somewhere in the middle there. So trauma, it functions to impair the brain. So not only does sometimes trauma will damage the brain, but it also stops the brain from functioning properly and from developing properly. Socializing is a survival level imperative. We need other people in order to survive as human beings. And one of the biggest threats that we can have is being ostracized. So a lot of the times when we think about threats, we're thinking about, I'm going to be killed, my body will be dead, or somebody that I love is going to die. But actually, our social survival is the same kind of level of threat, which is partly why bullying and social ostracizing can have such an impact, because we're hardwired to need the tribe in order to survive. We need it for food, for shelter, someone to have our back when the tigers are coming. And that evolutionary process hasn't really changed at all in thousands of years. When we don't have a secure, safe attachment as children, then we get all kinds of trust issues. We have, as we move through adulthood, we're not really able to form the kinds of satisfying, meaningful relationships where we trust other people the way that we would have if we'd had a different experience as a child. And another thing that happens is that we get very good at reading social cues. In some ways, we overdo it though. So sometimes we just get so hyper attentive to danger that we don't know when it's okay to relax. We just can always feel like we're being threatened in some way. This is a part of the system that's from the primitive brain. We don't really have conscious control over it. Our system reacts to perceived threat. So whether it's actually threatening or not, if we perceive it as a threat, then that's how our system's going to respond. Some of the common symptoms of trauma, in particular PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, is a high startle reflex, a hyperarousal, always being hypervigilant, kind of scanning the environment, looking around to see if we're safe, if we're not. And that's very hard on the nervous system. That's giving the nervous system something to do all the time. And so then we end up with anxiety, depression, problems sleeping. It's really dysregulating to the nervous system. When we have crisis trauma in particular, we might have flashbacks of the trauma. And those are, again, not under our control. The brain will just flash them in, and that's one of the really distressing things about having PTSD, is that it just isn't under our control. Feeling numb and immobilized, partly that could be from the overactivity in the nervous system. We just aren't built to be on red alert all the time. And so we can get into that numb, but that's also part of the freeze. So when most people think about the survival system, we always used to say fight or flight, and now you'll more likely hear people saying fight, flight, freeze. And the fight part, of course, is when we're going to mobilize our defenses and run away. There's the fight and flight are pretty easy to understand. but we also have an immobilizing. If I just freeze, and the way it could turn up in a family would be if nobody notices me, maybe they're not going to rage at me. So we just kind of hunker down and try and stay safe by being very quiet and being insulated and by not taking any risks. So one of the ways that this works as an adult is that we don't really trust people, and we don't really have the confidence to go out and try and form relationships because we're not really convinced we're going to be safe if we do that. And then all of the emotions that come with not having control of this. So there's crisis trauma and longer term trauma. So crisis trauma is the kind of thing that more people would think of, war, accidents, those kinds of things. It can also be, a parent dies or something like that, a job loss. There could be, certainly any kind of physical violence. Physical violence and abuse could be long-term, chronic, as well as crisis trauma. So developmental trauma happens during childhood, and it could be an incident that happened, that somebody was experienced some crisis trauma of they were beaten up at school or some kind of, somebody came to their house and abused them or something. It could be something like that, but it's more likely as a child that it's longer term and chronic. And one of the things that was very helpful for me to know is that the research over the last few years has come up with proof that, in fact, neglect and just that feeling of not really being seen and not really being welcome and not really being part of the family has an equal effect on our development as crisis trauma. And I had no idea. I just figured, that was me being oversensitive. So it's really good to know that, we're social beings. Children especially need a feeling of being cared for. And when we don't have that, then there's an impact. The brain doesn't develop the way that it could. And the other piece is that developmental trauma means it's more likely we'll get PTSD if we have a crisis trauma. That's something that's kind of good to know too. So a child's brain is shaped by experience, and we have a survival imperative for a safe, consistent caregiver. We need to have a safe attachment bond with somebody, hopefully one of the parents, somebody who's around all the time. And if we don't have that, then we talk about core deficiency stories in this work, and a lot of times that's where they come from, because a child can't risk blaming the parent or the caregiver for what's happening because that's too threatening to their survival. They need to believe that the parent, or they need to hope at least, that things are going to turn around and the parent is going to start helping them to feel safe. And so what we do then is, if there's erratic behavior, there could be mental illness, there could be all kinds of things going on in the family, loss of a parent. There's all kinds of ways that parents are not able to be present for the children in the way that is optimal. And when that happens, the children always turn it against themselves and think, well, if I was just this and this and this, I would be lovable and my mom would love me. Or if I was not so whatever, then, the things would be better and I'd be loved. So we can feel unloved, which would be a fact, or if an experience, a description of an experience, but then we can turn that into an identity of I'm unlovable. And most of us gather a lot of evidence for that over the years. And then once we have a core belief, then we tend to gather evidence that supports that belief. So we might completely miss evidence that doesn't support it. We'll only gather evidence, especially when it comes to our safety. It's very important for our survival to recognize threat, and it's not really important to our survival to recognize happiness or satisfaction or any of those things. So certainly it includes trauma as children, includes what we normally think of as abuse. With virtually everybody that I work with that has some kind of developmental trauma, there's been one of those types of abuse. Everybody who's in a family where there's addiction, where one of the caregivers has an addiction issue, the children are very affected by that. We often feel not safe, not like the environment is too chaotic. Even if the environment is really safe some of the time, if it's not safe consistently, that's what's really important to a child. It has to be safe consistently. And even if we have a long period of time where it's pretty safe, our systems still are set up to remember that one time when it wasn't. So, and that's the same if there's spousal abuse or anything like that. Our systems are set up to remember danger. So that helps to understand some of what goes on when we're paying attention to that. And chronic neglect, which I talked about, that just feeling that we don't matter, that nobody's taking care of us, nobody sees us, that's a really important part of developmental trauma. Partly because a meaningful, satisfying life depends on meaningful, satisfying social relationships. And if we don't have the trust that that can happen based on our experience, and if we don't have the brain pathways that we would have had if we'd had that kind of secure social interaction as young people, then that gets disrupted and it really comes into our adult lives as well. So this whole thing about chronic neglect is not just somebody wasn't feeding us or something like that. In my family, it was more emotions. There was a strong no talk rule. Nobody wanted to know what you felt. And it wasn't even safe to say what you felt because you're probably going to be ridiculed for it. So that's an example of something that nobody would have thought that would lead to developmental trauma in the past, and that their researchers are discovering that, in fact, that's a really big thing for a lot of people. So social interaction, we have this biological imperative to connect, and that self-protective emotional shutdown is part of that human tendency to avoid pain and go towards pleasure. So it's part of the freeze mechanism, that emotional shutdown is part of the way that we protect ourselves. So if we're not sure, based on our experience, that, when we probably all have memories of being as a child, we just kind of, run towards our parents to show them something. We're excited about something. And then we don't get met in that. And then there's a disappointment and kind of a letdown. And then maybe we'll do it again and again and still the same result. Or maybe once in a while we have a little hope that, yeah, they did actually see us that time. So that carries through into our adult lives too. And that emotional shutdown isn't something that we can really control on a conscious level of the mind. We have to start having experiences of being met, and we can meet ourselves. And I think that's where the natural rest and living inquiries really make a difference, because if we don't know ourselves and if we don't actually have some compassion and kindness within, then even if we get it from outside, it's not going to have quite as deep an effect. So that's not something that we should be blaming ourselves for. It's just a natural mechanism that happens as part of the freeze response, where we're protecting ourselves emotionally. And as we feel safer, then the need for that protection will start to dissipate. And in that talk that Scott just gave, one of the things that really struck me was that he said, after that experience in grade 6, when his wolf pack, he called them the sports boys, turned against him, he said, I went home that night and I realized the world wasn't safe. He also made reference to that's the first time he realized that. So a lot of children realize that a lot younger. And he realized it then. He up until that point, the world was safe for him. And after that point, it wasn't. And once you have that experience of it not being safe, then you can't ever unlearn that. So you can have experiences of safety that can help to put that in perspective. But that's an experience that we then know. We talk about the Velcro effect, is that trauma is stored in the body. And in order to release it, we need to do work through the body. And as we're experiencing activation, then of course we don't want to be present with these strong feelings. A lot of times fear is felt as something in the gut. There's often like a black hole. Often people describe there's a sensation, I'm going to be sucked into it, I'm going to die. It's very contracted. And there's just this feeling like no matter how bad it is, not feeling it, it's going to be worse if I feel it. So people have this reluctance based on, some pretty good evidence that it's not a good idea to look at our trauma and to be present with our trauma. And what we're finding is that, in fact, that's the only way that we can heal the trauma. Because with the Velcro, what happens is we have an experience, and we remember our experiences through words and pictures. So if you even think back to, what happened the last time you went to the grocery store, just something kind of innocuous. Just as soon as you bring it up, you've probably got an image of the grocery store, maybe at the shelves, maybe you going or something. The images will be a little bit different for everybody. And unless something kind of charged happened, you probably won't have much of a response in your body. But, you've got some words. I was at the grocery store, I was getting this or that. Or maybe it was, I was at the grocery store and I was buying ice cream, and I feel bad about that. Or maybe, it was something else. We just have all these different, it's just our own personal experience that comes up. So when we have an experience that was traumatic, then it's stored somewhere in our body, and we have these feelings often of dread. I know for myself, I've done a lot of work on healing my own trauma, and I feel like I'm pretty healed from it, but I always used to have this sensation of I needed to protect myself from behind. So I had a lot of like cement shoulders. I had a lot of constriction through there. I had images of kind of like a shield. And anytime I was the least bit activated or disturbed by something, I immediately put up my shoulders. And it took a while of working with that, the trauma in a lot of different ways, partly sitting with that sensation, but also partly of just working with the trauma, seeing it come up, being with the sensations. And then I realized that the actual trauma sensation for me was in my heart center. And so there's certain kinds of sensations that would come into my heart center, and I actually didn't really know that they were there because I was always focused on my throat. And what would happen is there'd be this pulsing in my throat, and that would be the clue to me that I needed to go get something sweet to eat. And so when I had that pulsing in my throat, the only thing that would really kind of help that make it feel better would be some ice cream or something like that. When I stopped doing that, and when I was, a lot of that trauma was starting to heal, then I realized that I had, in fact, a pain in my heart center. And then at one point I realized that that's where that stuff in the throat was coming. So this is kind of complicated, right? And we can also get to really know our experience when we sit with it enough, and to not be afraid of it. Like one of the things that Scott talks about is mining. So being present with a sensation and just kind of inviting it forward and say, okay, here's the sensation. It feels really scary to me, but I know that I can actually sit with this for a while. So I'm going to try that and see. We look at the sensation. What is it like? Does it have an image? Does it have a color? Is it sharp? Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it, we just look at the image and notice the sensation itself. What does it feel like? And then if that's a sensation that's associated with trauma, which normally it would be, then images might start coming up. Memories might start coming up. When did I first feel this? Oh God, I remember that from when I was 3 years old. First memory, I remember that. Or, I don't really remember that until, and then some memory will come up. So that's how we work with these sensations. So we might have always had this feeling that energy was something we could never handle because it was going to kill us. And then we have the experience of it doesn't kill us. We actually can be present with it. And that gradually starts to build this feeling of safety and the confidence that we can actually stay with something. And over time, that's what enables us to turn towards the sensation. So none of these things are things that we can really push into. We always have to work very gently with ourselves, because the minute we start pushing, our defenses are going to go up. So it really is an allowing and a creating more safety so that we can come to a point where we can actually have the confidence of surviving looking at it. So addiction, the way this relates to it, of course, is that when we have things that we're not willing to feel, or that we're not so much even willing, it's that we can't, we don't have the confidence that we can feel them, then we're going to do whatever we need to do to downregulate the nervous system and feel better. So one of the things that happens when we're children is ideally our parents are teaching us how to self-regulate our emotions. And that would mean things like, instead of telling a boy that they shouldn't be crying, it would mean, being present with the child that's crying. and helping them to work out a way of actually feeling their emotions and not being taken away by them, not being destroyed by them. A lot of parents don't know how to self-regulate or don't have very good skills in that area, and if we can't, then we can't pass that on to our children very well either. I can see a big difference in how my son and his wife are teaching their children to self-regulate compared to what I was doing. So most of our self-regulation was the same way that I self-regulated, which was around food. And so they've got some other tools in their toolkit now and more awareness. And, part of it is that, things are changing. We understand these things a lot better now than we did before. And so, I don't really lay a big guilt trip on myself the way I did for a while. And it's just really good to know that there's this system. We have a nervous system, it gets charged up, and we need to know how to self-regulate and how to down-regulate the nervous system. And we naturally will do whatever we need to do to down-regulate the system because it feels really lousy when it's charged up. And if there's some kind of an addiction going, that's perfect because then we don't have to feel. And until we come to a place where we have the right tools and the right support and some kind of, a lot of times it's when someone's hit bottom that they're so desperate that they go, okay, I'm ready to actually do this now. So all of those factors come into this. And what's really clear to me is that the trauma is what needs to be healed. And that's why Scott talks about a trauma-first approach, is that we can white-knuckle our way through recovery, but unless we heal the trauma that originally got us into the addiction, then the recovery is not as likely to hold. So this really is a healing journey for all of us. And there's many, many kinds of addictions. It could be shopping, it could be gossip, it could be, there's all kinds of things that we wouldn't necessarily think about like that. I have a family member who can't stop talking when she's anxious. She drives everybody else around her kind of crazy. But the more anxious she gets, the more she's just like, blah, 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 and it's like a wall of words. And they're not words that make a lot of sense even. She's just kind of empty in her mind because she's so anxious. And so knowing that that's a pattern and knowing why that's happening is helpful for me because, it helps me to kind of manage being around that a little bit more. But, that's just an example of something we wouldn't necessarily think of as an addiction. But it's a stress reliever valve that, things get to be too much and I'm just going to do this pattern. A lot of the patterns we developed when we were kids. And they've just kind of carried through. There can be a lot of hopelessness around addiction that, we kind of feel like, well, I'm so bad now and I've created so much harm and how am I ever going to come back from this? And some of it is kind of real in the sense of our bodies can be very harmed by whatever it is that we're doing addictively. And a lot of it is society's shame and guilt, and there's a lot of social judgment that comes along with being an addict of any kind. And some addictions we can hide more easily. Other addictions show right on our face. And, it's just that there's a climate of secrecy and shame that really makes the whole addictive process worse. And harder to work with. They've been also doing a lot of research on is resilience. And I found this was so interesting. Dr. Martin Seligman is one of the researchers that started this, and he's done a lot of work with the armed forces in the U.S., and there's a similar project going on in Canada, and I'm sure there are in other countries as well, where they got really interested in what's going on. Why are some soldiers coming back with PTSD and other soldiers aren't? And that was when they started doing the research and discovered the developmental trauma connection. So if you've had developmental trauma, then you're not in as strong of a place when a crisis hits. And so the crisis in war, of course, is that you're feeling in fear for your life, and often you see other people die around you or you're injured. And so for us in civilian life, it could be some kind of a crisis comes up that's really hard to deal with it, and we do deal with it, and we develop more confidence because we've dealt with it and we haven't run away from it. And so resilience can happen from difficult and challenging circumstances. And what is it that makes some people more resilient than others? And they've got a whole bunch of evidence now of what works to make people more resilient. And some of it has to do with kind of reframing experiences. Some of it has to do with, different kinds of therapy and stuff. A lot of it has to do with healing the nervous system too. Like if we can do practices that heal our nervous systems, then the level of arousal will come down. We won't be quite so hypervigilant. It doesn't take so much energy. And that's one of the ways that we can improve our resilience. And another factor in this too is our thought patterns. If we have a lot of anxiety, then we're likely to have a lot of fear-based loops of thought. And if we can work with those, that'll decrease the anxiety. It's easier on the nervous system. Everything kind of settles down. So it's all really linked. There's a lot of complexity to this, but it also means there's a lot of ways that we can work with it. So that's really exciting too, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that just because there's all these factors that led into it that we're kind of hooped. It really means that we can work with this in a lot of different ways. And just getting more sleep will help. Or, going for walks more, or developing more social connections with people, even if it might feel scary. There's a lot of ways that we can work with this. Increase our ability to be resilient. I mean, that's the kind of underlying thing there. And I know that for those of us who've been working with the inquiries and natural rest, we can see our nervous systems healing, and we can see that we're starting to get more capable of being present with things that we probably wouldn't have predicted we could a year ago. So we can see that really happening in our own lives as well. So trauma treatment has really, really changed over the last 2 years in particular, and over the last 5 years and 10 years. And part of that is the explosion of medical devices now that can actually track what's going on in the brain, PET scans and fMRIs and all that kind of thing that the scientists do. So they have a pretty good understanding now how this works. And it used to be that talk therapy was kind of the only therapy that was available. And the kind of fringe people might have done some yoga or mindfulness or something like that, but it wasn't very mainstream until recent. And so what happens with talk therapy is that it's actually pretty helpful to understand the mechanism and to understand, okay, these things happen, like the developmental trauma. Very helpful for me to understand how that laid the ground for me getting PTSD years later, and how it laid the ground for a lot of the decisions that I was making around relationships and things like that. And talk therapy, trauma is not stored in words. Trauma is stored in the body. So we need to do something to work in the body. Dr. Richard Miller is a psychologist who started working with the Walter Reed Medical Center and working with soldiers with PTSD. I think it must be 10 or 12 years ago now. It's a long time. He was one of the pioneers with that. And they're having amazing results with it. And he does a practice of yoga nidra. It's a little bit different than the type of yoga nidra that you might be familiar with, but it's a body sensing and being present with sensation in the body, and then being aware that that's arising in this spacious, the field of awareness. So it's a practice that helps people to really deeply come into their bodies and be present in their bodies in a safe way. So that kind of research also led to, a whole bunch of other modalities now that it's not so common anymore for mainstream medical people to be working just with talk therapy around trauma. For the most part, even over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a lot more acknowledgement and evidence-based now that you have to work with the body as well. So the living inquiries are one of those ways that we can do that. Even though we're not moving the body like we might do in yoga, we're paying attention to the sensations in the body, and we're getting to know our own patterns and our own sensations as they're coming up. And over time, the Velcro is releasing, and that's what helps to release the trauma. They know about the different parts of the brain. Kay talked about emotional flooding, and how when we're emotionally flooded, the cortisol and different hormones come in and take us offline. The prefrontal cortex goes offline, and that's the same kind of with trauma. When we're activated, the shutdown valve gets pushed by the primitive brain, and our prefrontal cortex doesn't have a lot to do with it. until we feel safe enough that we can come back and attend to that. And that makes sense evolutionarily because we needed to get ourselves away from danger. And then that was the first and the only priority was to get away from danger. And the problem with us is that we sometimes have our brains stuck on red alert when actually it's not. And that's the kind of thing that can really be helped with healing the nervous system and allowing that to happen. The vagus nerve is kind of two parts. The lower part in the gut is the more primitive part, and the higher part goes from the heart up. And that has a lot to do with social interactions. I was fascinated to learn that 80% of the messages in the body, between the brain and the rest of the body, come from the gut up to the brain. And that's because we have this sensing system, that's that old primitive survival system. And people who have been traumatized, as children especially, but in adulthood as well, develop a very keen sense of danger. We know because we're always kind of scanning for it. It's a little bit like women are a lot more sensitive to social cues than men are because our survival depends on being able to read the men around us. And they don't have to so much. Most men aren't in danger from other men, whereas most women potentially could be in danger from most of the men around. So it's just one of those things that develops. It's like when you're blind, you develop better hearing. And when we're feeling traumatized, we develop better skills because we feel like we need them. So we develop, the ability to really sense someone's energy, and probably that involves, the look on their face, their body language. There's a lot of subtle things that go into that. And so that's this neuroception. So it's in the brain, but it's also in the gut. It's all through our system that we perceive whether or not we're safe or whether or not we're dangerous. And that isn't something that's really conscious level of the mind controlled. There's the whole thing around, do I feel safe with someone or not feel safe with someone, has to do more with the other person. And are they calm? Are they erratic, or are they stable? And we can really pick that up, especially if we've had trauma in our background. We have a pretty well-developed sense of that. So the thing with trauma, the treatment for trauma, is that we need to start to feel safe. And how we do that can be in a lot of different ways. I mean, obviously, if there's danger in our environment, then we can work with that and try and minimize the threat there, or whatever that we need to do in terms of that. We can also work on our nervous systems. We can work on being around people with whom we feel safe. And the experience of safety is part of what creates safety. So we need to actually experience being safe, at least at times, in order for that to even be a possibility. And that's part of where we get to working with our own lives, is that if we have a habit of being very aggressive with ourselves and really judging ourselves and shaming ourselves and being impatient and why did you do that? You're so stupid, or whatever words that might come up, then we're actually not very safe to ourselves. And it's a real mindfulness practice and a willingness practice to be able to be very present with that. What's coming up in my own experience, the way I talk with myself, the way I am impatient with myself, the way I judge myself, the way I shame myself, that I could actually work with that directly. And as we start to work with that, we become safer to ourselves. And that opens up the possibility that, that feeling of safety can spread out. And then there's also a lot of kind of practical things that we can do with that. Exhaling stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. It's through the vagal system. Exhaling is what stimulates the relaxation response. And the inhale is hooked up to the sympathetic nervous system and the stress response. So if we have a lot of stress, our breathing is going to get dysregulated. And even if all we do about the stress is to work on the breathing and help ourselves, that gives our nervous system a chance to actually down-regulate through the breath. One of the easiest things to do is to do something that allows you to exhale for 6 seconds or more. Singing, chanting. Dr. Peter Levine is one of the trauma experts. He recommends just chanting VU. So it's just VU. Just count in your mind up to at least 6. And then inhale regularly and VU. It's just the syllable doesn't mean anything in particular, but it's just a way of focusing your mind and allowing yourself to breathe longer. So I play the flute, so that's very relaxing, partly because I'm exhaling almost entirely with a little bit of inhale and then more exhaling. So that's one of the reasons why that can be helpful. And so anything you do, we have this 2-to-1 breathing practice where we're exhaling longer than we inhale. Any kind of breath work is probably going to be very helpful unless breath work is triggering for you. If that's the case, and that does happen with people for sure, then some other kind of relaxation that doesn't involve the breath would be more helpful. So I can't really stress enough how important it is to work with the nervous system and to heal the nervous system. So our nervous systems have been under so much stress for so many years and have worked so hard because we're feeling this perception that we need to protect ourselves. And that's really hard work. It's hard on the the cortisol and the hormones in the body. It's just really difficult physically as well as emotionally. So there's a lot of things that we can do to increase the health of our nervous system, and that'll make a big difference. This is Lynn Fraser. This has been a presentation for the Kiloby Center for Recovery Family Services Program. You can reach us through kiloby.com and follow the links to the Kiloby Center and Family Services. Our website is kilobyfamilyservices.com. You can reach us through Gmail at kilobyfamilyservices@gmail.com. Please get in touch if you would like to know more about our weekly program or about our retreats. Thank you.